UK where it's raining and it's gray. But let me start my presentation by sharing my screen. Okay. Can everyone, okay, that,
Yeah.
assuming everyone can see my screen, it's okay?
Yes.
Okay, no problem for my
Yep,
side.
no problem. So, so to tell a little bit about the presentation today, I'll be talking about active learning today because of the situation we are in, because of the circumstances of COVID-19. So we're talking about implementing the active learning in distance modalities, at a distance, remote learning. And I want to say that active learning is much more important today and now because of the distant modalities than it might have been a year or 2 years ago. And that has been a surprise for me of how important when I give my online classes, it is for me to think what active learning was in the classroom and now what it will be in front of our computers, in front of our digital devices. In my presentation, I have some spaces for questions and answers, but if you have a comment or a question in anything I say as we go through the presentation, please feel free to type it into the chat box. John will be looking out for any questions, and he will tell me if I need to stop what I'm saying to answer any questions, and that's fine. That is an integral part of active learning, because active learning basically focuses on the student. It focuses on the learning. We as teachers are not as concerned about what we do as we are about the effect of what we do on our students. Are they learning? Are they engaged? What are they doing? So that is the key to active learning. I would also like to say something about active learning in the sense of it is not something completely new, okay? As teachers, we need to update. We need to keep up with the times, as it were, okay? And active learning, I mean, I've been in teaching and education for over 35 years. And I remember 30 years ago, 20 years ago, there is the feeling that there is always something new. And when I started thinking about active learning, I thought, why do we need something new? Well, as teachers, we respond to the society around us. We respond to the communities around us. And education must keep up with the times as medicine does, as psychology does. We are not talking about active learning because as teachers, we were doing something wrong in the classroom and now we need to do it better. No, we are talking about active learning because in the 21st century, education has changed. And one thing that we can see that education has changed is the way that we are delivering today's presentation. We are using online and digital more and more, and that will lead us to asking questions about what is learning and how can I continue to get them to learn, okay? So as I continue in the presentation today, I'm going to focus on these three questions throughout. What is active learning? What are we talking about? Why is it important? Okay, and what does it look like in the digital classroom? Okay, so for all the teachers here in the presentation today, I'd like to say that we are educators. So whether we are delivering active learning or whether we are delivering our lessons online or face-to-face, our focus is always the same, on learning, on education. The way we do it is changing, but what we do is very importantly education, learning, teaching. And so as we do it with a different means, let us remember our expertise, which is education, okay? So as part of active learning, I'm going to ask you, and of course, I can't see if you have or not, but I recommend that now, thinking about active learning, what 2 questions would you have, okay, for me about active learning? Okay, and write them down on a piece of paper in front of you. Okay, and the reason I do this is crucial to active learning right from the beginning, is involve your students. Right from the beginning, you assume your students have a contribution into your lesson. So here, I am assuming that you have some questions, you have some curiosity. The question could simply be, what is it? The question could be, I've heard of it, but I don't know exactly what it is. The question could be very general, very specific. But what it does for you, and what it does for my students in my class, and what it does for our students, is it gets them involved from the very beginning. So take about 30 seconds, a minute, as I talk and go through, write down 1 or 2 questions that you would like me to answer in this presentation. Okay. Now that also sets up in our classes that when we reach the end of our lesson, if we are talking about, today it's active learning, but if in our lesson we are talking about management, we are talking about productivity, we are talking about going on holiday in Asia, when we get to the end of our lesson, my students can look at their question and say, oh, teacher, you haven't answered this question, or we didn't answer this question. That could be something for my next lesson. That could be something that we could answer there. But my students are involved from the beginning, okay? Now, what is active learning? So you could see the little sign I put on there, I teach, you learn. So it is very important for our students to understand, okay, that it is 2 different responsibilities. I can teach all I want, and it doesn't mean that they will necessarily learn. They don't have to pay attention. They don't have to pay as much attention as I want. But learning is a responsibility on their part. So active learning basically is, okay, an approach that actively engages the students in their learning. Okay, and the key word there is actively. Okay, so it is learner-centered. As teachers, we are always wondering, what is my student doing? What should they be doing? What do I want them to do? It is learning by doing. Okay, it is not talking to them and them talking to me about learning. It is itself. If we are doing the present perfect, we want to be using it, and we want to create situations where they will be using it. And it is a system of support and challenge. As a teacher, you are supporting those students who need help with the activities that you have set up, and you are challenging those students who may find it easy or easier, and you're moving them on. So by the nature of the lesson, you are doing differentiation. You are appealing to each student based on their needs. And we'll talk about that with some of the activities. Now, I've mentioned already why it is important, okay? And first, it meets the needs of today's students. I have there 21st century education. The needs have changed. We live in what you could say is a smaller world because everyone is closer to each other than they were before. It is also active learning responding to brain-based research. How does our brain work? What kinds of things can we do in education that helps our brain to work? Okay. Active learning also develops the idea of 21st century skills. So learning by doing, creativity, communication, problem solving, critical thinking, and various other skills that we need today that maybe 20, 30, 50 years ago we didn't need, and we need to develop those skills in the classroom. Some people will call those soft skills, people skills, but they are skills that are very, very important to our students today. Okay, And I think the last point here is that it emphasizes learning over teaching. And that made me very uncomfortable at the beginning. But it is the idea that whatever I do, if it could be something that I believe in, but I must see that it's having an effect in my students. Okay, I must look at the learning and see if it's working. Not that it should be or should not be working, but that it actually is or isn't. Okay. Now, in active learning, in your classes, okay, we should look at students being more engaged. You don't want students to be passive. Students, our attention spans today are decreasing. So a student can pay attention for a certain amount of time and then nothing is going in. Okay, so learning is an effort, so they need to be engaged in that effort. Learning needs to be relevant to them. Okay, so in your classes, in your schools, you look at a student and you don't want the student to come in, sit down and say, teacher, teach me. That doesn't work. Okay, they need to be doing something, but what they need to be doing must be relevant to them. They must see that it's useful. Okay. Now we're also going to, through active learning, build collaboration, because the interaction here is not just between teacher and student, it's between student and student, and it's between the whole group. So there is a lot of interaction here. And so because of that, we will develop strong communication skills, okay? Because we will need to communicate what we have learned, share it with the class as we move forward, okay? Now, let's look at specifically active learning in the classroom. So today, I'd like to focus on in general, what are we doing in the classroom? And then I'll mention some activities, okay? So first, we want a positive classroom environment. Now, I haven't changed this because now we are doing it mostly digital instead of face-to-face. It's still the idea. My classroom before was a physical classroom. And now my classroom is on a screen and my students are in different places, but I still need a positive classroom environment. I want my students to feel that mistakes are a natural part of learning. And I tell my students, if they are not making mistakes, okay, then that they are not stretching themselves. They are not challenging themselves. It is when they make mistakes that they are actually learning and working out the language that I'm trying to give to them. I also want them to know that knowing the right answer is not enough. This is not where we are going to do a test or we're going to do an exercise, and if there is a sentence and they need to complete the word, if they tell me the word, we are happy. No, I still need the complete sentence because we're working on pronunciation. I still need a natural intonation, a natural pronunciation, so I know that what they're saying is and will be communicative. Okay, and I want someone to challenge it if they don't agree. So just giving me the answer is not enough. Okay, and sharing that, why we believe that is the answer, is important. Now, in English, in a language class, sometimes that is difficult for our students to explain why. So that is an ability that they will develop. So beginner students have much more difficulty, and intermediate to advanced students might find it more easier. But it is important that if we share, it fixes it into our brains. We remember it longer. It is more useful for us. Okay. So I want to develop that. And even though we're talking about in new circumstances. So when we talk about our distant modalities here, my session will focus on having a basic class with an online platform where your class is in front of you. Now, in each one of your situations, you might see to what extent you have a flipped classroom, to what extent you are going to use blended learning, to what extent your teaching and their learning is synchronous, at the same time that you are teaching, or do you expect them to do some things before or after class? Now notice I am avoiding the word homework. So in this context, in the digital context, the easiest example is reading. Do I want my students to have read a text before they come to class? Or will we be doing that reading synchronously together in class? And those are decisions for you in your schools, with your class, with your students. I will take them into consideration. Please ask me if that's your situation of how to do that. But today's presentation will not take specifically synchronous, blended learning, or flipped classroom. And they are an integral part of the online learning that we are doing today all over the world. Okay. Okay, so as you can see here, I will have a slide every once in a while for questions and comments. I will ask John if there are any questions, any comments, and then if not, I will continue. It's a good opportunity for everyone to take a sip of their water, tea, coffee, whatever drink you may have, to think about what I have just said.
We don't have any question in the chat box at the moment.
That's fine.
Maybe if anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask to Verissimo directly.
No?
Okay, let's wait a few more minutes.
Yeah, if you don't have questions, it means I have to work more. So questions are good.
So I guess Suna Akalın has a question. We just received a message from her saying hi.
Hello. And what's...
Suna Hocam, do you have any question? Or were you just testing if the chat box is working or not?
Well, don't worry. We have this questions and comments slide will come up throughout the presentation.
Okay.
And of course, at the end of the presentation, I will be here to answer any questions. Okay.
We have a question, Verissimo, from Betül Hocam. Can you see the chat box, Verissimo? She's saying, actually, practical learning, especially in medicine, can be hard. What is the way? That's the question. So, practical learning in the medicine, what would be your advice, I assume?
Let me get the... are we assuming there... I assume practical learning, that we're not talking about the actual practical learning of learning medicine, but of learning English for medicine. Can I say that any learning that we do is practical? Of course, in the classroom, we are one removed from whatever the situation is that the students will use English. So we are not in the hospital, or we are not with the patient to actually get the practical side. But we can try to recreate the needs of the student, wherever it is in the outside world, in our classrooms. We can recreate, we can bring the outside into the classroom, okay, and then see the needs of that English there. Okay, that's one thing. So as students, we can recreate those. We can bring them in through videos. We can bring them in through situations for which we create dialogues and language. Okay. The other thing is the students can bring in those situations also. They can see, I mean, in my classes, I teach some corporate classes, I taught business classes, and students will come in and say, I was in a meeting yesterday, or I had a phone call yesterday and I needed this word, or I will have a phone call, or I will have a meeting next week, and I don't know how to do this. Now, in general, can I say, if you look up community language learning, This was done back in the 60s and 70s, and it's the idea of bringing the outside world into your classroom to make it as practical as possible. Okay, and I'm assuming that the question dealt with the language of practical situations and not the practical situation of medicine itself. Okay, which would be an interesting situation in itself. Okay, I hope that helped. Okay, I'm going to continue now and give some more opportunity for questions a little bit later. Is that okay, John? Are we okay?
Yeah, sure. Betul says thanks, by the way.
Okay, great. Thank you for the question. Yeah, good question. Okay, so I'm going to try here to give you a lesson framework. Now, remember, this is a framework. Okay, when I teach my lessons in class or online, and especially online, I keep my board in front of me, and my board always has a little post-it note, and my little post-it note has my lesson framework. It is just the key. It's about 7 lines of what I will go through during the lesson. The framework, if we look at the images here, we live in an image society, in a visual society. So, and I put this framework here, and I think the picture looks nice, but it also tells me something, and that is that my lesson will have all of these parts, okay, that puts all this together. In the end, what I want is a nice structure. It's not important this one or this one or this one, but if I put them all together, okay, I've got a better structure. So that's the framework that I'm looking at. And the points that I'm making here is in my lesson framework. Let's start with the beginning here. And the beginning is I want to make a connection with my students. In our classrooms, we always made connections because we were there. We would ask the questions. We would greet them at the beginning. If they are a football fan, we might have talked about the previous day's football. Whatever it might be, we would make a connection. Online, it is easy to forget that connection. Okay, so we're going to try to make a connection. We're going to discuss the previous lessons so that our lessons are not just one, okay, or different points here, but they are points that come together and build into learning. Okay, we are going to consider what knowledge do they need before I start my lesson. Okay, and we are going to tell them what we are going to learn for that day, for that hour, for those 2 hours. Okay, and then as we continue, and this should be okay, and please notice should about 10 minutes of your lesson. Okay, so if you have a 45 minute to an hour, take about 10 minutes to build that connection, mention whatever we talked previously, take care of any words or anything we need for the next, for this lesson, tell them what we are about to learn, and then go into your activities. Okay, so about 10, 15 minutes. Now, if you can do it in about 10 minutes, that's great. Okay, I can't always do it in 10 minutes. Sometimes it takes 15. Sometimes my student brings up something that is interesting and takes a little bit longer, but I know in my head that I need to get to my activities. So this is an introduction as I warm up to my lesson. Okay. And then as I continue, I go into my activities, and we'll talk about that. In those activities, I want to consider assessment for learning. So I want to consider how do I know my students are learning, and we'll talk about that. And then I want to finish my lesson with my plenary and a personal reflection, which is about the last 5 minutes of my lesson. Okay, so when I observe lessons, and I have been in Turkey for many years, for the last 20, 25 years, I have gone to Turkey on and off, and I have observed a lot of lessons. And I know that it's always difficult at the end to remember that we need these 5 minutes because the activities were interesting and students were interested and we got involved and we forget. But that idea of a plenary and a personal reflection on the lesson at the end is important for our brain for us to learn better. Okay, and I'll talk about that also. Okay, so if we take each one of those points in our lesson, let me now talk a little bit more about them. So why is it important to make a connection? Now, when I observed classes, connections were automatic because we're teachers, we're social, we like the human personal interaction, and they were part of our lessons in our classrooms and our schools. But when we went online, we didn't automatically have that. We didn't automatically have that connection. Students were nervous, teachers were nervous, the situation was new, we were all learning. So making the connection was important. So very basic, check the digital basics. Do your students know how to mute or unmute? Do they know how to use the chat box? When they use the chat box, can everyone see it? Are they using it just for you? Can you send them a message to the whole class or to individual students? So whatever you need, check the basics, make them feel comfortable. This is new for them. If you have students who feel very comfortable with it, great, bring them in, make the others comfortable. Change always takes a little bit of time, so consider that. And then bring in that personality into your classes. Now we need to look at that. Whereas before we took it for granted, we need to look at that. So I will usually ask my students, what can you see outside? Because now they are in different situations. As my sessions are international and you are in different parts of Turkey, what can you see outside your windows? It is 2 hours earlier here. It's very gray out there. In one of my classes, we decided that in that class, I wanted everyone to wear their favorite t-shirt. So everyone came to class and visually we were all looking at each other's t-shirts and we talked about, again, why the t-shirt was important, why they liked it. But the key was to create a comfortable environment and to build that connection, because our brain learns better when we are comfortable, when we feel safe, when we are enjoying what we are doing, and we build those synapses and they become stronger. So in our I don't like to say the word normal, but in our normal classes, in our face-to-face classes, we took that for granted because we did it naturally. Here, we need to think about it a bit more, okay? As we go on as we've built that connection, okay, we want to think about our previous lesson. What we're doing is we're tweaking our brain to think about where we were before. We're tweaking our brain to go from Turkish to English, okay? And we're saying to our students, do you have any questions, any doubts about what we did before? When you considered what we did in our last lesson, did any questions or doubts come up? But what we're telling our students is, I hope you reviewed what we did, even if it's for 5 minutes, but that review makes that connection between our lessons, okay? It tells us, what do you remember? What did you forget? We all forget things, okay? I might tell my students, if they're not doing it much, I'm saying, tell me one thing you learned in our last lesson. What do you remember? What did you learn in our last lesson? And again, I'm trying to bring my previous lesson into my current lesson, into my next lesson, so that our learning is more fluid, okay? So bringing in the previous lesson. Again, 1-2 minutes, maybe 2-3 students do it. The others have done it, but 2 or 3 will discuss it. But we are connecting, okay? And then what do I need and what do they need for the lesson we're about to give? So one, in our new situation, what digital features do they need? Are you going to use the chat box? So do you want to make a little activity for the chat box before your lesson begins because everything is okay? Okay. Or are you going to use their mics and they're going to speak? Okay, so can you hear everyone? Do the mic speak? So are you going to use breakout rooms? So do you want to do that? Are you going to use annotate? Are you going to do something outside of the platform? Whatever it is, I recommend that you take each feature one by one as students get comfortable to your new online classroom. Unless you are very, very confident, and your students too, and they have prior experience, it is important that the technology run smoothly, okay? And as a teacher in the class, you will do the technology and the lesson itself. In my presentation today, I am focusing on my content, I am focusing on my presentation, and if there is any problems with the technology, I have John here to take care of it. And that is a comfort as a teacher, because I don't have to think about that. In your classes, you are the one thinking about that. If a student, the microphone doesn't work, etc. So one, take it slow, take it as all of your students get used to it, and then move on with the lesson little by little. What language will they need? For example, if you are doing the past simple, and you're doing the past simple, and your lesson will be what they did yesterday, do they remember the verbs of daily routine? Wake up, get dressed, shower. Do you need to review those? Do you need to review any knowledge, any skills? So this is the little things. Now, can I say, in your lesson, this really doesn't need to take more than 2-3 minutes. If you think it takes more than 2-3 minutes, then think about your lesson again. It may require more from your students, okay, than you have time for. So try to break it down. And I'll mention that as we consider the lesson more. But we're talking about one skill, one feature, something that takes 2-3 minutes. You check that it's okay, and you can move on because you'll need it in your lesson. And as we come to the end of that first 10 minutes, tell them what we are going to learn, okay? What do you expect your students to learn by the end of this lesson? If your lesson is 40 minutes, what do you want them to have learned by the end? If your lesson is an hour, what do you want them to have learned by the end? If your lesson is 2 hours, what do you want them to have learned by the end of those 2 hours? And consider the content, consider the skills. Are they developing reading? Are they developing writing skills? Consider the language. Should they be able to use the present perfect by the end of the lesson? So what do you want them to do by the end of the 40 minutes? Now, some teachers tell me, oh, I need 2-3 lessons to do this. Okay, but then break it down. What do you need them to do in the 40 minutes, and break it down into 2-3 lessons. But you want a sense of achievement that your students will get by the end of the lesson. I'm sorry, John, were you signaling? Do you have is there a question?
No, actually, there is no
Okay.
question. Only Suna just made a comment.
Yes.
On the chat box. So she has got 2 comments actually. The first one, when you were talking about the lesson plan, Suna says that means we show our lessons plan to SS. That means screenshot. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Suna hocam. And also when you were talking about about the slowness of the lesson, she said that when we are slow, time is consumed.
Yes. Okay. Good. Yes. So to take away the first part, first is, I don't mean that you need to show the lesson plan to your students, but you need to share with them what you are going to do, and maybe if you want to, why you are going to do it. So very simply, today we are going to learn how to use the present perfect. Today we are going to develop our reading skills. Today we are going to talk about our holidays. So something that when your students are in the middle of an activity, they know why they are doing that activity, because they are developing that skill, or because they are learning that vocabulary or that grammatical point. So giving them the learning objective is usually enough. When I observe classes, I like to go into a room and know what the objective is. The easiest way to do that is create a habit, if you can, of putting that, making a slide and putting that slide up for your students, okay? and have that all the time. I have had where I have given my class with my board and the learning objective was there all the time. And I keep looking for digital ways to keep the learning objective as part of my lesson. So today, because my presentation is on PowerPoint, I might have put my learning objective at the top here all the time. So as I go through the lesson, my students will always be able to see it, okay? In relation to going slow, it is very important to consider teachers' attention span and students, sorry, especially students' attention span. So if our class thinks that it's going slow, their minds will start wandering to something else. Okay, so the pace of our lesson, and that's why I say this should take about maximum 10 minutes at the beginning of our class. Giving the learning objective should take 1 to 2 minutes. If it should not be explained, we are giving the objective. It should be clear. If it needs to be explained, then it won't make sense to your students. So if you say today we are going to learn the present perfect and they don't know what the present perfect is, then you say today we are going to learn the present perfect. Here's an example. You give the example and then you move on to the lesson because they don't know it yet. But that means that during the lesson, their mind can focus on why we are doing all those activities. And again, we live in a visual society. If you look at the picture that I have here on the slide, it is again based on that idea that we have the whole lesson, but we're going to focus because we're doing this listening, we're reading this text because today we are practicing, developing, learning, whatever it is. It helps our students to focus, okay? And so we learn better when we know why we are doing an activity. Okay, and so throughout your lesson, you might say, guys, why are we learning this? What is this exercise for? And they should be able to look at an activity, an exercise, and say, oh, it's all the present perfect, or it's all the past simple, or oh, it's all about the future. They should see the connection between the exercise and your learning objective that you established at the beginning of the lesson. Okay, so we're helping our students to focus, and by focusing, they'll be improving. Okay, so if you look at our lesson framework, okay, from the very beginning, we are creating and establishing expectations for our lessons. We are not only doing our lesson, but as part of active learning, we are also communicating to our students what we expect from them. We're trying to make them feel more comfortable. We're trying to make them look at the previous lesson to think about it. These are adults and they need to be more active in the way that they learn. We don't want them to show up in class and say, teacher, here I am. What are we going to do today? No, we want to say, oh, teacher, the last lesson, do they, if it was vocabulary, do they remember 4 to 5 words, whatever it might be? So we are not only teaching, we are encouraging and creating, establishing expectations for learning. Okay. We just had some questions and comments. I might be able to move on, John. Yeah.
Sorry, we don't have any question in the chat box, but dear teachers, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question directly at the moment. You can directly talk to Verissimo. That's totally fine if you have any question.
Yes, yes. Okay, I'll continue, and if something comes up, tell me.
Okay.
Okay. Now we're going to the main part of our lesson. If you have a 45-minute lesson, okay, think that 30 minutes will be spent on the activities. If you have a 1-hour lesson, still about 30 to 40 minutes will be spent on the activities themselves. The activities should help students achieve the learning objective. Okay, so whenever you're thinking, oh, I'm going to do this in class, think to yourself, does it help my student achieve the learning objective? And a very simple example that I've observed is sometimes a teacher will find a video, and the video is good, it's funny, but the lesson was about, and I like using the present perfect because it's usually the most difficult ones I teach. And my lesson is on the present perfect, and maybe in that video, the present perfect comes up maybe once, maybe twice. So it's a fun video, it's a good video, but it doesn't really help my students meet the learning objective. So as much as I like it, I might not use it in my lesson because what I want is to help my students achieve that learning objective. It should be clear, so very easy to do. If it requires a lot of instruction, it may be too difficult an activity, and it should be engaging. Always think of, during that activity, what are my students doing? Not thinking, not how they are being, what should they be doing? And I will mention when we talk about activities, what, okay, the differentiation may mean in that, okay? Now, I'm going to give an example of an activity today based on reading, okay? I've taken this as a reading on Van Gogh. You don't need to read it. I promise I will not give you a test on it, but it's a very basic little text about Vincent van Gogh that I took from the internet, just to show you what I mean by students being engaged in their learning. Now, reading is a passive skill. It can easily become a passive activity. If your students, in the sense of the flipped classroom, read before they come to class, you're not sure really how well they've read or not read. During class, as they are reading, you shouldn't be interrupting. So it's a quiet time. So I want that to be a bit more active. So while they are reading, okay, I'm going to do 3 different types of activities. Okay? I'm going to do a true false, I'm going to do a close gap, and I might do a word search puzzle. Now, I can do 1 of these, all 3 of these, 2 of these. It depends where my students are. What I want to show you with this is how to involve my students, what it means to have an active learning approach. So these, the true false, my students already know it. So what I want my students to do is go back to the text, okay, take a sentence and change one part of it. And then write, okay, that sentence. So in my text, it says, he was born in, I think it was 30th of March, 1853. And I have here, he was born in 1843. Very simple sentence. The student has simply changed 1853 to 1843, okay? I can make it a little bit more difficult. When he was younger, he wanted to work for the church. Okay, now the text says that when he was younger, he wanted to be a pastor. And that's almost the same thing. It's false because, again, the student is writing these sentences. As a young man, he traveled abroad. The text says he traveled to London, Paris, Belgium. So the students, now, you as the teacher are not writing the sentences, the students are. So as your students in class are reading, you tell them, okay, take 3 to 5 sentences from the text, okay, and either keep them true or false. Now they are reading, they take the sentence, they write the sentence on a piece of paper, and then about, if they're reading online, I would give them no more than 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and they read 1 paragraph. And then I would say, okay, a teacher, do you have a sentence for us? And a teacher says, he was born in 1843. The whole class is listening. Someone raises their hands, either digitally or like this, and they say, no, false. False, why? They all go back to the text. A teacher takes the text and says, oh, yes, of course. It says, he was born in 30th March, 1853. Okay, good. Next, Burak, can you give us a sentence? Now notice we read, the students made the exercise. So the teacher, you weren't at home making 10 true, false statements about the text they are making. If you have a class of 20, of 10, of whatever, if you ask your students to make 3 sentences about the text, if you have a class of 10, you now have 30 sentences to deal with. And you have 30 sentences at their level. Each student is reading that text at their level, choosing the sentences at their level. And each time it is, you'll see that my 3 sentences are false, because false is best. You say, oh yeah, prove it. I don't know. Yeah, I think yes. He was born in 1853. I remember that. And then they go back to the text and no, it says he was born on 30th March, 1853. So you see the interaction back and forth. But now reading is an active activity. It's active learning. Your students are making the exercise, responding to the exercise, and using the text for that exercise. You can use true, false. You can also use close gap. Students can take a sentence from their text and they miss out a word, okay? They can, or they miss out the last part of the sentence. Again, your weakest student can go to the text, choose a sentence, and take out a word. So this is a task that in differentiation, it already works because every student can go to that text at their own level. Now, at this point, when students know that for their reading texts, they will make the exercise, they are going to do something interesting. And that is, they're going to try to make it more difficult. Because they know their sentences are for their friends and not for the teacher, they will go to that text and try to find a sentence that will confuse the class and make it really challenging. But when they are doing that, they are reading more deeply. They are going to the text, to the part that they think is difficult because it's difficult for them. So they are already focusing on that part of the text that they need. But notice the idea of the active learning approach. The students are making the exercise that is clear to them because they've done these exercises before, okay? They are making the exercise themselves and they are sharing that exercise. The teacher is facilitating that exercise works. The teacher is saying, Burak, do you have a sentence? And so if it's a big class and you don't want to unmute the class, it's one of my big challenges right now in online classes for me, then they can write the sentence in the chat box. Everybody reads, everybody goes back to the text, and then you can discuss. But I would like to say, as a challenge for me, most of the advice that I've been given and I see online about mute is that we mute our students as they come into class because it helps control the class a little bit. And I completely agree. At the beginning, I agree. But I think it's a challenge for me that I would like my students to come into class, not be muted, and be able, okay, to take the responsibility for that and manage that. It will take some time. It will take some time. Now, I'd like to also talk about a word search puzzle. Now, I am doing a word search puzzle because it will take more time to find the answers to the questions and the words that we have from the text. More time means more effort with the text. More effort with the text means deeper learning. Okay, so we don't move on very fast. But let me explain how to do a word search puzzle. First, students can do word search puzzles. There are programs online for that. If you go to Word Search Puzzle Maker, you'll see a lot of programs. But I like my students to make their own because of the process. So it's 5 simple steps, and they're going to make a puzzle as the example you can see here. Okay. So as my example here, and what we're going to do first is I'm going to ask my students to pick 5 words, usually 10 words from the text. Okay, less than 6 your brain does not really function. And more than 10, your brain can easily go into overload. So anywhere between 6 and 10 words challenges your students. If you do 12 or 14 words, it could be too many. Okay, here I put 5 as just an example. So I went to my text, I took 5 words that I think are important to the text, and I wrote them down here. Next, okay, I'm going to put those words in my puzzle grid. So if you look, you can see painter, you can see art dealers, you can see pastor. The only thing I ask my students to do is don't make a puzzle that is backwards. So online, I send my puzzle grid to all my students. They have it so that they can make their own puzzles. Some of them prefer to go online and they have their own puzzle maker, and that's okay. If they do on my grid, I tell them they are dealing with the vocabulary more, they will learn, okay, more, okay? And the reason we are doing the puzzle is because we have more time with the language that we need. And then we're going to put letters at random so we can hide the words. And you can see all the words here are hidden. And then, okay, they can give, okay, the puzzles to their friends to solve. So in my online classes, they do this as a PowerPoint. So they have the grid. I give them the grid. They put the grid, this that you see here, they put the grid on a PowerPoint slide, and the students are looking for it. Some of my students have started sending to each other. I am trying to make this online more and more because in class it worked very well as a way for them to learn, as a way for them to deal with the text. And as they are looking at those words, they are relating those words to the text. So what does art dealers have to do with Van Gogh? And if they remember, they're making a connection, a sentence. If they don't remember what art dealers has to do with Van Gogh, they go back to the text, they read for that. Now they have a reason to read, a personal, individual reason to read. They might say, teacher, why pastor? I don't remember why. What's pastor? But they don't have to ask the teacher. They can go to the text. So notice that active learning with the teacher facilitating, okay? Now, if the words become a little bit more difficult, you can put the two together and have the students create sentences from the text to help their friends find the words. So this is a sentence. He spent his early adulthood working for a firm of, and they should know because they read the text. But if they have forgotten, it's okay. Remember, mistakes are part of learning. Forgetting is part of learning. So all they have to do is go back to the text and find how can I complete this sentence? They find the sentence in the text, they find the answer, but they still need to find the answer here. And because they have to find the answer in the grid, it takes them time. Because it takes them time, their brain is working on the vocabulary or the grammar that they need. So the reason I always mention the puzzle is because learning is effort. And effort means that learning, okay, becomes deeper, okay? So again, I'm gonna go a little bit, I'm gonna continue in this activity. I think this presentation is being recorded. So if I've gone a little bit fast, you will have my email at the end if you want to ask me any questions, if you want the grid. But the idea here is a simple activity, a simple reading activity, but where the teacher would make all these exercises, let your students make the exercises. If they make the exercises, they are learning. Okay.
Verissimo, actually, we have a few questions.
I thought we might on this activity. Okay.
Okay. Let me show it to you.
Okay.
Oops. Sorry. Yeah, here they are. Can you see the questions?
Okay.
The first one, it starts from Suna Hoca.
Okay, good. I completely agree with the first point. So the true false is not enough unless they support the answer with a sentence from the text. That is perfect. Remember, the right answer is not enough. In our classes, just having the right answer, true, is not enough. In all, I always ask my students why. I don't think that, I think it's false. And they need to go back to the test. So I completely agree with that, that the exercise, the true false, the close gap, the matching, whatever we do, always needs some discussion, some effort. The right answer is not enough. Do you think paraphrasing can help in increasing reading comprehension? That is also a very good question. Now, I, in my examples, gave just a brief idea of paraphrasing. So going to London, Paris, Belgium as a different word abroad. That is a fantastic skill for your students to learn. So one of the skills I would use with the activities in reading would be students being able to paraphrase, okay, making their sentences, having the class discuss whether it's true or false. Now, sometimes they say, no, teacher, I think it's false. I think it's true. And they may have made a mistake in paraphrasing their sentence. Fantastic, because that means more discussion. And more discussion means more effort, and more effort means more learning. So it doesn't matter that they create perfect exercises. They create reasons to discuss, and those are always great. So paraphrasing is a skill that we would teach our students, and it's a skill that they could use here for the reading comprehension. If students can go back to the text, what is the role of the teacher in this activity? Because they can do it by themselves at home without a teacher, okay? And that's a perfect example, Akan, I think that's a perfect example of the flipped classroom. And that's where you need to decide, are your students doing this at home before they come onto class, or are they doing it as part of the class? Now, if the students can go back to the text, what is the role of the teacher? And the role of the teacher there is facilitator. If this activity and all the sentences in true false that your students are making are too easy, then your role is to say, hey guys, that was very easy. That wasn't, okay, that was too easy. Let's write one more sentence each, but come on, let's challenge each other. Because if it's easy for them, it will be boring. They want to challenge. Now, can I say in my classes, my students will try to make them difficult because they know the sentences are not for me, they are for each other. So they try to make them more difficult. But the role of the teacher here is to facilitate, support when they need it, but to challenge when it's too easy. Remember, this is learning to learn. We can look at our students and say, was that worth it? Were those sentences really worth it? Did you guys challenge yourselves? And they know, and they will challenge themselves and tell them, oh, I found that too easy. Guys, here's one of my sentences, and then give them an example. Remember, they are the ones learning. It is in their interest. You're not trying to catch them at a mistake. And that's a very good point, okay?
You can share your screen again, Verissimo.
Okay, where am I? Here it is. Yes, is that? Okay. Oh, I went back.
No. Yeah.
I think here it went back. Okay. And I'll move it forward. So as we're making our puzzle, let me go back here. Okay, so again, a very good question from Akan, which was that idea of if they're doing it at home. So consider in your classes, whether it's a situation for blended learning, whether it's a situation for the flipped classroom, consider what you are doing with them synchronously at the same time, considering what you would want them to do. So you might want them to make their puzzles, share their puzzles, solve their puzzles, and then the class is a discussion on the text based what they have read. The puzzle or the exercises tells you that they have read the text and gives them a way to deal with the text without simply passively reading. Okay, so again, so they're writing the sentences. Okay, if it's online, okay, give your students time to write the sentence on their own. So if I'm doing this online, I might have them do only 1 or 2 sentences each, one true and one false. If I want more control at the beginning, I might have them write in the chat line so everybody can see it and think about it. As my class gets better online, I might unmute and they'll be able to discuss it. Okay, this takes time for them to get used to the online environment. Okay, let me just change here because students read for the answer. So they're going back to their text and they're saying, is it true? Is it false? If it's too easy and they don't need to go back to the text, then encourage your students to make more challenging sentences. Okay, always discuss. Why is it true? Why is it false? Where did you find it? Where in the text? Go back. It's that interaction. And then think about when students are used to doing this, think that they can do it in their breakout rooms. So you can have groups of 4 making the sentence for each other, and now each group is making more sentences. In my classes, I always need to work together, model it before I send them to the breakout rooms, and then they must know in their breakout rooms exactly what they need to do, and also they need to be responsible to do it. Okay. We can do, I'm going a little bit faster on this, but we can do the same thing for listening. So it's video, we can begin with, what do you see? If it's a listening, we can create the context. Who do you hear? Where are they, do you think? What are they talking about? So here, notice we are teaching them to learn how to deal with a listening text. When we're listening, not to listen all at once, but to manage that text, okay? And, okay, as we do this with speaking and listen, give them a reason to listen to each other, okay? What words did we learn in our last lesson about whatever it could be? In this case, I put art because I didn't need a second line. It was a small word. But what words did we learn in our last lesson about art? And one student tells me paintbrush. And I want the next student to repeat and add another word. So they have to say paintbrush, canvas. And I want the next student to repeat and say paintbrush, canvas, easel. It could have been easier, brush, paint, whatever it could be. But notice, each student is only adding the word that they learned. There's no wrong answer. Whatever word that they remember, that's what they say. But everyone has to listen because they are repeating. And as they are repeating, they are making connections to our last lesson. Oh yes, we learned about Van Gogh, and he worked with different types of canvases. Oh yes, and he took his easel with him. And they're making connections with the text, but they're also listening to each other. So in my classes, this is an activity that I try to build up, even online, that I try to get the responsibility for, but it encourages them to listen to each other. It is very easy online for students to become passive. So this is a very simple idea that I reinforce with them. Okay, listen to each other, okay, interact. It's not only you to me, it's you with each other and me, okay? And again, to go back to that really great question, the teacher's role is facilitating that learning, making that learning easier, supporting the students in that learning, okay? So I'm going to mention here, what words do you see? And I'm just gonna talk through it. I've taken some pictures here, and I want my students to think of any words that they can come up with for these pictures. And again, the reason I'm doing that is I start from the student. There is no wrong answer. If they want to tell me upset, or if they want to tell me sad, or if they want to tell me angry, I don't know, but whatever word they tell me is not wrong. Beginning an activity where the answers are not right or wrong, but what the student has to share with you gives them confidence. Sad, upset, oh, angry with each other, happy. They could say coffee, they could say table, they could say plant, they could say green, whatever they can say, whatever they want to say. But begin the activity with them first and then develop that. So here I begin with 5 words related to the picture, but then I'm going to challenge them. 3 words no one else has written. Now they know that probably everybody's going to say plants, so they're not going to say plants. And maybe everybody's going to say happy, so they're not going to say happy. But they might say smiling because they think, oh, nobody's going to think of smiling. They're going to think of only happy. Whatever it is, what I've done is my role was we started with the students and what they knew, and then we challenged them to go a little bit beyond. Okay, and we've created that situation to help them with their learning. So active learning with online, and I encourage my students to have a pen, to have a board or a piece of paper, because learning is kinesthetic and so is writing. So writing on their piece of paper the words helps them remember, okay? And so again, an example of students getting involved in the activities, making the activities simple, clear, but with students being engaged, as students doing, or as I like to say, in your classes, your students should work more than you. Okay, John, I know that we're coming toward the end. I might continue on till the end and then take questions at the end, if that's okay.
Sure. Whatever is fine for you.
Yeah, that way, if anyone needs to leave at a certain time, we will have finished, and then I'll continue on here for any questions people will have. Okay. So as we're coming, so notice those 30-40 minutes of my class will be those types of activities that students will be working on, and they will be more engaged. And if I have a perfect class, it is the class that I can stand back, watch my students learn, and to take an example from the classroom, from the face-to-face, walk around, support, and challenge. Online, look at their screen, look at what they do, go to the breakout rooms, ask one question here, one question there, but they're doing it. They're the ones doing it, and I'm only helping. So that's an ideal class. Doesn't always get there, okay? Doesn't always work. Please do not feel stressed as if this has to be perfect. And I'm always thinking, how do I know that they are learning? What can I see? I can observe. I can give them a little task. I can give them a little activity, okay? Or I can simply ask them, how do you feel about that? How did you feel about that listening? How did you feel about that activity? And have them share. What we want is to see, we don't want them to notice that learning did not take place a lesson or 2 lessons later. We want to do it as much as possible in class. So as you're doing your activities, think, how do I know that they are learning? Is it because what they're writing in the chat line? It's because the words they are giving you? It's because the interaction? Or is it because the reflection? How do you feel about the listening? And it could also just be across your screen, a hands up, okay? And now, if you notice, I like using an online, my students going like this. I don't mind them clicking and putting hands up, but for learning, them going like this with everybody activates the brain more than clicking on the thumbs up symbol. It's the same thing, it's easier, okay? It's just a preference of mine, just so, okay? Now, think about teacher talk versus student talk. So try to go for open-ended questions. If I go back to my text about Van Gogh, it's not worth saying, when was he born? 1853. No, that's not it. Okay. So questions with what, questions with how, and questions with why usually require more English from them, where questions with where and when, who, usually require short answers. Follow up on the questions, especially, oh, I don't think so. Are you sure about that? What do you mean by that? I don't think I understand. Okay, that gets your students to expand more on their answers. Give them a chance to pause before they answer. A question can seem like a test. So, okay, everybody, take some time. I want you to think, did Van Gogh have a happy childhood? Okay, take 1 minute to think, and I'll get back to you. Give them that 1 minute to think, to go back to the text, to look for their answers, okay? And again, when I mentioned no hands up, no mute, in class, I didn't have my students raise hands. In online, I am trying to work with not muting my students, but I should say that's not always easy, okay? And at the beginning, it's best to start muting, but my goal is to begin and have our lessons without the mute, and that we are able to work in that environment, okay? So, and always remember with questions, if it's a silly question in Turkish, then it's a silly question in English, okay? Because if it's a silly question in Turkish, it means your question is just for the language. It's not a real question. So if you ask, when was Van Gogh born? It is very natural that a student should say, well, teacher, can't you read? It's the first line. So students begin to see that that's not a real question. That's like a small test. We're testing to see if you know. But we want to go on beyond those questions. So if you wouldn't ask it in Turkish, don't ask it in English. And that's usually a good sign for you, okay? Okay, and now we're coming to the end of our lesson, and we're coming to the plenary. So we've taken about 10 to 15 minutes at the beginning, okay? We've developed our reading skills, so that's why we're reading the text. We've done true, false, close gap as a way to see how well we are reading, okay? You want your students to be aware of how much they have learned at the end. You know, we take what we know for granted, and the mistakes really stand out. But tell them, what did you learn today? Okay, what do you think you have achieved today? Okay, it could be a simple question. Okay, it could be writing it down. Write down one sentence that you think you've learned or achieved today. If it's a skill, if it's a language, vocabulary, grammar, or redoing an activity. So we started learning some vocabulary at the beginning of the class. We did some exercises, we did some discussions, we had a listening. Go back to the first activity. When that activity was difficult, well, 40 minutes later, how are we doing? Okay, so that is a way to see how much have they learned. Okay, and then okay, and again, like I said, one sentence. As your students get better at that, okay, you might just have 3-4 students answering. But you want to encourage them to think, have I learned? Have I developed? Has this situation from an hour ago, where am I now? And I'll forget in a day or two, but where am I now? And then how we feel about how we learn is important to learning. When the brain feels safe, comfortable, enjoying the situation, okay, we build stronger synapses, we build stronger connections to that learning. So taking into consideration how they feel is important, and share this with your class. Tell them, guys, the reason I'm asking you this is because if you feel tense when we do a listening, that will make it more difficult. So we need to see, why do you feel tense? What is it about listening that makes you tense? But we need our students to feel comfortable. We need our students to feel good, not because it would be nice if they did and if they enjoyed our classes, but also because it helps them to learn. And we're dealing with adult students. So share this with them. Tell them the reason I'm doing this, and it could be simply as thumbs up, thumbs down, How do you feel about the listening? How do you feel about the present perfect? You can bring back your lesson objective, and they can see how well they do that. And they could have a simple sentence saying, I felt very good. I felt tense at the beginning, but then it was better. The listening was a little difficult, but I think I'm better than I was last week. Whatever it is that they say, one sentence, it helps you and it helps them, okay? Okay, and you may want to consider from this as a second phase, a goal to focus on. If a student feels, oh, we learned 10 words and I only remembered 3 or 4, that may be something that they want to do outside of class. Go back to that vocabulary. If they don't feel very, very comfortable with the present perfect, that may be an indication that they will work on the present perfect a little bit outside of class. So the reflection can also lead. Now, good students and good language students will do this automatically. If they notice they haven't learned something, they will take the initiative to learn. So we want to encourage that in the students who would not normally do this, okay? And again, share that with them, okay? Now, again, as I mentioned before, as we come to the end of our lesson, we're taking about 5 to 10 minutes maximum as we finish the lesson. So if we look at our lesson structure, even online or face-to-face, we're looking at 10, 15 minutes as we go into the lesson objective before the activity, 5 to 10 minutes at the end as we round up that activity. And the meat of our lesson, the most part of our lesson, is those 30, 40 minutes in the middle where we are working on the activities, where we are working on what we need to progress our language, okay? So I will, of course, I will give time here for questions. I want to thank everyone, one, for inviting me, for listening to me today. As I mentioned at the beginning, I love talking about education. I love talking about learning. So it was a great opportunity to be here and talk to new teachers. Here I have my email address. If you want to ask any questions, if any part I have gone very fast, please feel free to send me an email and I will try my best. I usually find that when I receive emails from Turkey, a little bit of the Turkish sunshine comes with it. And I'm in the UK, so a little bit of Turkish sunshine is always fantastic and always welcome. And then I just want to thank everyone. I will be staying on for as long as there are questions. John, if there are any questions to answer.
Yes, actually, there was one question and one comment. Let me show it to you.
Okay.
Here. Can you see them?
Okay, so when the students interact with one another in English, they can also learn wrong things such as grammar rules, pronunciation, etc., from each other. You know that correcting something wrong can sometimes be more difficult. What do you think about it? Oh, Hakan, when I said I liked questions, I didn't mean difficult questions. So Hakan, that is a fantastic, fantastic question. And it involves a lot of things. So when students interact with another in English, they can learn wrong things. So the first thing as a teacher and the role of the teacher is you need to look at that and see what is wrong. So whenever my students make mistakes, in my mind, I always think, is it a lapse? Is it a mistake? Or is it an error? Okay. If it's a lapse, that means they probably will not repeat it. Okay. So if they say, yesterday let me see. Yeah, I go to the cinema and I see, and I think, is that a problem with the past simple that I need to interrupt and correct? Or is that just the student trying to think about the movie and they won't make that again? So that's a lapse. Do I need to correct it? So I might make a note, okay? So students, you need to decide when to correct, when to intervene, and share that with your students. So the first thing I ask my students in all of my classes is, do you want me to interrupt when you make a mistake? so that they know. And then I also ask them, sometimes you make a mistake and I don't interrupt because I want to see if it's a mistake you will repeat. So you mentioned there are grammar rules, pronunciation, etc. So agreed. See if that pronunciation and that grammar and that word, if that mistake keeps coming back. If it's an error, the students need you to correct it because they think it is correct. That's what an error means. So to go back, a lapse is just, well, native speakers have lapses. It's a mistake that will not come back. So probably not worth interrupting. If it's a mistake, it's something that can be easily corrected. So if it's bad pronunciation, you may just naturally say, automobile? What do you mean? And they say, oh, teacher, the automobile, and they've corrected their mistake. Perfect. But if it's an error, they may need more intervention from you. Correcting something wrong can sometimes be more difficult. What do you think about it? Make the corrections part of your classes a natural part of learning. Okay. See if you can get your students to repeat, and always tell your students that if you are correcting, it is because you want them to repeat the right way. If you correct and they say, oh, yes, I forgot, that's no good. They didn't repeat. So if they mispronounced automobile, you want them to pronounce it correctly. And in my students, I always ask them to pronounce it 3 times. First time I say again and they pronounce it. And then I sometimes say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. It's just an excuse. And they already know, they start laughing. But again, it's because of the active learning and the brain. The first time they say it, the second time they reinforce it, by the third time they don't think about it, learning has become natural. Okay, so those 3 times. They can also learn from each other. Error analysis will help us on that, I think. Yes, error analysis is very good. Remember that you want your students to remember the correct part more than the mistake. And that's the key when doing error analysis. In error analysis, you are appealing to the student's thinking, to the student's reasoning. And you want that reasoning to replace the mistake. So it's very difficult to do, I think. Okay, in my classes, it's difficult to do. You're always balancing how much time to analyze and how much time you simply need to move on, okay, and get the correct version, okay? Again, as a teacher, it's up to you. But because a student knows where the mistake is and knows what the mistake is, doesn't mean they'll be able to use it correctly next time. So the question as a teacher is, does this discussion lead to them improving? So for example, the best example is the past simple. Many students already know the past simple. And if you give them a test, they will know the past simple. But when they speak, they don't use it. I have a good student right now. She's an advanced student and she avoids the past simple. We can have a discussion for an hour and she won't use it. So to have a discussion about the mistakes of the past simple is not worth it for her because she knows. She's just not using it. And I've told her, you avoid it. You're not using it. And then I tell her, look, I need you to use these 5 verbs in the past tense within the next 30 minutes, okay? And then she writes it down and that's her goal. Because what she needs is to move on to the practice, not to the reasoning. So you always balance, okay?
Thank you, Verissimo. We don't have any other question in the chat box. Dear teachers, if you have any question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly to Verissimo. If we don't have any other question, I would like to give word to Sibel Hoca from Bale's team. And then we will be closing up with the last word from Cengizhan Hoca.
Okay, thank you so much, John. As the education manager of Bale's Turkey, I would love to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Toste for the great presentation that he did on behalf of Bale's Turkey. Mr. Toste, it has been a real pleasure to listen to you, as always. I've been listening to you with admiration and respect. Dear colleagues, I mean, when we first, started to think of the topic of the presentation, we thought that as an institution with more than 40 years of expertise in more than 32 countries, we thought that it is a part of our responsibility to give the teachers in the field of education, no matter what the subject area is, to give them a helping hand so that they can fight with the challenges during the post-COVID, period. And we know that during the post-COVID period, the emphasis is on learning to learn rather than teaching. We did our teaching, but now it's time for the students to become aware of how they learn, because it's high time that they started implementing those strategies in other fields of learning as well. So it seems that we have to come out of our comfort zone. And as the representatives of the field of education, we have to do our best to build back better. And in order to be able to do that, we have to be using everything that we have in our repertoire so that we can provide the best kind of expertise and education to our students. So I would like to cut it short, but I would like to express the fact that please always bear it in mind that as Bale's family, as part of the education, we will always be here to give you a helping hand in any kind of area in the field of education, because we know that our other responsibility is to be able to provide the teachers with kind of strategies that would accelerate the change process in the field of learning and teaching. And thank you very much for attending. It was a pleasure to host everyone in this online platform and having the expertise from all of you. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice day.
Cengiz Hocam.
Yes, I would just say thank you to, first of all, Verissimo for his kind and wonderful presentation, and the BELS team. And I would like to say that I hope we would really organize a face-to-face webinar, or a face-to-face seminar in Erzurum in a short time, okay?
Hopefully. Wishful thinking, Hocam. Wishful thinking. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, John, shall we? Thank you. Enjoy your day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Enjoy your day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Yes,
so
thank
much.
you for the
Bye.
participation.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
See you all.